So several months ago, our preaching planning team got together, and as we were just praying together and thinking about what God wanted us to take our church through here at Northside, one of the things that we began to really understand and feel is just there's just a lot of relationship struggle, relationship pain, hardship in relationships, whether people are single and waiting or single and dating, whether they're newly married, experienced in marriage, whether they're at home managing the household or they're at work managing a business. There's a lot of relationship conflict, a lot of relational stress, a lot of struggles that are really playing themselves out, and we just see it all around us. We say, man, we need to address this. And so about 4 weeks ago, we launched this series called This Could Be Us, and I began that series just talking about the reason why our relationships are so hard, but also giving some hope of what they could be. This is what it could be. And then I introduced to us this tool that can be used in relationship development if you're dating, or in relationship maintenance if you're married, and it's called RAM. It's the Relationship Attachment Model, and read this in a book by Dr. Van Epp that was called How to Avoid Falling in Love with a Jerk, which I highly recommend the book. It's a great read. But Dr. Van Epp, who's a professor and a therapist and a researcher looking at a lot of research, put together this relationship attachment model to help us understand relationships better. And one of the things that was revealed in this, as we look at the 5 dynamics of attachment, of bonding that happens in a relationship, is if you're developing a relationship, or if you're in a dating relationship, you never go further in one of these categories than you've been in the previous one. So you don't trust someone that you've not already come to know. So, unless you really know this person, you're not then going to fully trust that person. And you're not going to rely on somebody that you have not come to trust. The level to which I know someone determines the level to which I trust them. And the level to which I trust them then determines the level to which I would rely on someone. And this is where I really want to stop today. I want to talk about rely. Every week we're taking a different one of these dynamics. And so if you're just joining us today, or you're just joining us online, I want to encourage you to go back and watch those sermons. They really do progress and develop with one another. But today I want to talk about rely. There is a difference between trust and rely. Just to illustrate that, I have this stool on the stage, and this stool is something that I know this stool. I know quite a bit about this stool. In fact, I've used this stool multiple times. I trust this stool. But I'm not relying on this stool. And the reason I'm not relying on it is because I'm not sitting on it. There's a difference between trust and rely. I can trust it, but I'm not relying on it until I actually sit on it. Wouldn't it be awesome if I fell right now? You were just thinking, that'd be awesome. I know you were just thinking that. It would have been so cool. It's possible. I mean, it could happen. But I'm not trusting it fully. I'm not relying on it fully until I actually sit on the stool. There's a difference between trust and rely. Relying on someone means that this is a person in your life that you can count on. You have come to believe that you can count on them. When you begin to rely on someone, it means that it takes the relationship even deeper than just trusting them. It's taking a step towards mutual meeting of each other's needs in significant ways. When you begin to rely on someone, you're making a greater investment into the relationship. You begin to lean in on one another in healthy ways. You see, relying on someone is the outward manifestation of trust. It's the outward manifestation of trust. And that kind of healthy reliance is good. It's actually good. God created us for relationship. From Genesis to Revelation, we see this. We see that God created us not to be completely independent. He created us to be completely dependent on Him. In Him we live and move and have our being. In Him is life. Jesus said, apart from Him we have nothing. We are completely dependent on God and should live that way. But we're also interdependent on one another. God created us for community. There's this scripture in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 9 through 12 that says, 2 are better than 1 because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. Also, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. We're better together than we are by ourselves. When you have people in your life that you can rely on, it brings out the best in you. When you feel loved and supported, when there are people meeting your needs in life, you thrive. And that's what research has shown. It has shown that satisfying relationships are characterized with this simple formula: 2 people mutually meeting each other's needs. And when that formula is activated, people feel cooperation and support and deep feelings of fulfillment. In other words, the mutual meeting of one another's needs in healthy ways leads to deeply satisfying relationships. People who really learn to rely on one another in healthy ways leads to deeply satisfying relationships. Now, that could just be friendships. I mean, that happens in friendship. You come to rely on a friend. That can be coworkers or someone that you work with, and you come to really rely on them in your work or in your business. It can mean dating relationships. It can be applied to your marriage relationships. All of that is true. That relationships deepen and grow when we become to the point where we can begin to rely on one another in healthy ways. And what's sad is so many people don't ever get to this point. They're not in deeply satisfying relationships, not at work, not at home, not in their lives. And I'll tell you, one of the reasons for this is because there are some significant barriers that exist that keep us from a healthy reliance on other people. And here's the first barrier. It's right here. It's the barrier of self-reliance. The barrier of self-reliance. Some of you were taught that to be successful, you had to be independent. You were taught that. Be your own man, be your own woman, don't rely on anyone. If you want the job to get done and get done right, then do it yourself. If you're financially independent, then you'll be freer. If you're relational independent, then you'll be happier. If you don't need anyone, then you can be a self-made success story. And this is kind of the teaching we get in our culture. And what's sad about it is what it's actually created is people who are lonely. They don't have any close friends. They're relationship poor, but boy, they're self-reliant. I was listening to a podcast this week and heard a statistic on there that came from Tim Elmore, and he has a leadership podcast on founding leaders. And he said decades ago, when research was done, they asked people in America, if you had an emergency in the middle of the night, how many friends do you have that you could call on? That you feel like you could call on in the middle of the night? The average answer was 5. 5 friends I could call on in the middle of the night. They just did the same research again recently. And they asked people in America, if you had an emergency in the middle of the night, how many friends do you have that you feel like you could call on? And you know what the average answer is right now? 0. That was the average answer. 0. We have become relationship poor. We're more private. We're more alone. We don't have people to rely on. And some of you are sitting here going, man, that's crazy. I can't believe that they would say 0. That's because you're in a small group. It's because you have things built in to the community of faith that other people don't have. And I know you got people you can call on, because I'm getting text messages yesterday like crazy from different small groups telling me about things going on in some of the other people's lives that are happening in our church. And they know about it before I do because they're in a small group. They're getting cared for by people. But most people in our world don't have it. Our self-reliance has led us to say, I don't need anybody else. And because of that, we're relationship poor. And I'll tell you another reason why we're struggling. It's because the barrier of a guarded heart. A guarded heart. This can come for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes we have guarded hearts because of hurt in our relationships. We don't want to hurt again, so we live guarded lives. I don't want to feel pain again. I don't want to be hurt, and so I'm not going to share my life with people. And when I don't do that, then I don't have people in my life to help carry my burdens. I don't have people in my life to help give me context and perspective when I'm overwhelmed by a problem or a crisis in my life. When I'm going through hard times, there's not people to support me, give me advice. Sometimes a person with the guarded heart can appear on the surface to be like a pillar, man. They're a rock. They're solid. They're unmoved. But over time, what you begin to realize is they also really struggle to be vulnerable and transparent and relational and interacting in intimate ways. They can almost appear to be more mechanical than human. Because here's the problem. A guarded heart will cause your reliance level to be way lower than the level to which you actually trust someone. You may know this person, you may trust this person, but man, you're not going to rely on him. Because you're going to have a guarded heart. And when you do that, the relationship struggles. Some people may say, I'm only going to rely to a degree. Well, then the relationship only grows to a degree. I know some people have grown up in emotionally constricted homes. Or maybe one or both parents in that home were there was deficiency when it came to emotional bonding. And so they don't share their heart. They're very guarded. I know in marriage, a guarded heart can really lead to polarization. Polarization happens when you feel like someone else doesn't understand you or they're not listening to you and they've got their opinion and their feelings about that and it's completely opposite of yours. And polarization happens when you get tunnel vision. You can't even see what their real needs are or their heart or what they think. You usually see it in counseling when one person is talking and the other person is just shaking their head no the whole time. It's just polarization. We're not on the same page at all. We don't see things the same way. We can get on opposite ends of the spectrum. I see my mate's needs as unrealistic and demanding. Polarization can slip us into self-centeredness. It's all about my needs and my desires. I'm not looking to Christ to fulfill my needs and then going to share my life with someone else. I say I'm looking for them to make me happy, and they're not doing it. So I'm not generous with my mate because you know what? They're not very giving to me. And it creates a vicious cycle of relational damage. And we see it in marriage all the time. Polarization, self-centeredness. I'm not going to rely on you at all. I'm just going to rely on myself. I'm not going to get anything from you, and I'm not going to give anything to you. It's creating a lot of relational damage. Here's another barrier to healthy reliance. It's extreme emotional dependency. This is the opposite end of the spectrum. In other words, one of the barriers to healthy reliance is unhealthy reliance. When our normal needs are taken to extremes due to emotional brokenness. In other words, we all need to be loved, we all do, but taken to an extreme, this becomes dependency. We all need to give, but taken to an extreme, this becomes codependency. We all need to trust, but taken to an extreme, this person is completely naive and not making decisions based on what they know. We all need to rely on someone, but taken to an extreme, it can cross healthy boundaries where we're depending on someone else to fill us with things that only God can fill us with. When you're not in a healthy emotional state, you become too dependent on others to fulfill the needs that you have. And those feelings of insecurity, loneliness, impulsivity, unresolved childhood issues can lead you to lean and rely so much on someone else that you squash them. And your relationship's unhealthy. Make sure you're not bringing your relational hurt based on neediness into a relationship. Because extreme emotional dependency means that your reliance level is all the way up, well past where it should be. I'll give you some true stories of this that have happened. One is Luanda. She's a true story. Her story is shared in the book that Dr. Van Epp wrote. And she was one who she found the normal guys boring. Anybody know of someone like that? They just find the normal guys boring. And the reason for that is the overly controlling man just consistently caught her eye. So when Anthony came along, their romance took off fast and furious. True to form, Anthony made Luanda feel drenched in his love. He convinced her that she was his breath of life, that without her, he was nothing. They didn't hold back sexually, believing that their passion was unrivaled and that they would be together forever. And in time, however, Anthony started becoming extremely jealous, almost as if a switch had been flipped. When she looked really pretty or she was talking to someone else, he would become critical and insulting. His rage intensified. And nothing she would say would help. She tried making promises. She tried following his demands, but Anthony always found something more. He would threaten her by saying that either he was going to walk out or he would end the relationship and find someone better. And then she would cry, becoming obsessed with losing him and begging him to stay. Why was she so stuck on him? Because she grew up in a home where she didn't feel loved. She didn't feel like she belonged. She didn't have a father who reached out to her and cared for her and showed her that she was valued and treasured and cherished. So she looked for that and longed for that in someone else. And she always looked for it in relationships that were unhealthy. It seemed like the unhealthy guys who had their own issues, who had an over-dependence on approval, who became very controlling, were the very ones that she was drawn to. Anthony would temporarily drug her need to belong and to be wanted. But the problem is it would also fuel his paranoid, controlling behavior. These two had unhealthy emotional needs in their life, and when they looked for it in the other person, it went to the extreme. His extreme emotional dependence led her to an unhealthy relationship. The same thing happened to Tom. Tom grew up with an alcoholic mother. He was the oldest of his siblings. His mother acted more like a child than she did a responsible adult. She was often passed out on the couch whenever the kids would come home. And Tom found that he never went anywhere because he was the one that was taking care of his siblings and the one who was protecting them from potential harm that would come whenever she wasn't in a good place. He would usher them into a room and he would entertain them through the entire evening. He often was the one who fed them, who provided for them. This was his growing up experience in an alcoholic home. And so when Tom met Kara, who was this strong-willed, independent, outspoken, carefree, anything but domestic, he was drawn to her. She was exactly what he wanted to be. He felt more carefree when he was around her. So they got married and they had 2 children. And carefree Kara wanted nothing to do with staying at home, keeping house. She would frequently stop at friends' houses or hangouts after she worked and taking care of the children, cooking dinner, doing laundry, whatever needed to be done. Guess who that fell to? To Tom. He was doing exactly what he had done all of his life that he wanted to get away from. But the problem was he saw in someone who was at the opposite extreme end of the spectrum something he wanted to be, and he chased after it and pursued it. But it created, because of his own unhealthy thinking and behaviors, he was attracted to the opposite extreme. Thinking it would fix the emotional imbalance in his life, but instead it multiplied the problems and only fueled it further. These are the things that don't allow us to have a healthy reliance in our relationships. So what I want to talk about here for just a couple minutes is the benefits of when we take the risk to rely in a healthy way on people we've come to trust, which is based on people we've come to know. And here's what you're going to find. When you risk to rely on others, here's what you find. Number 1, you find God's answer to loneliness. When we risk to rely on others, we find God's answer to loneliness. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, we read this: "It is not good for man to be alone." Now, when God said this, think about it. Adam was in paradise. He was in a perfect place. There was no corruption. There was no sin. There was no decay. There was no pollution. It was paradise. And God says to him, it is not good for Adam because he's alone. And so God immediately created Eve. God hates loneliness. God created us for relationship. God created us for community. God has dwelled in community from eternity past. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, one God, dwelling in perfect community for eternity past. He longs for us to have that kind of intimacy in our relationships. And some of you are in marriage relationships where, if you're completely honest with yourself right now, you're not putting in the work to care for one another in this rely dynamic. Because you've decided there's just some ways in which you're just going to be self-reliant. And you're not interacting with one another in a healthy way. You're actually feeling lonely in your marriage. You feel distance between one another. And that's where Satan loves to gain ground. That's where he gets his footholds, is in the distance between us. Maybe right now you feel like roommates, not companions, acquaintances, not partners. You've become self-reliant in your relationship. Now, maybe you committed to one another in marriage. So maybe your commitment level is way up, but you're not relying on one another. You're not caring for one another's needs. You're not reaching out to one another. You're not serving one another. In fact, it almost feels more like a prison. I'm committed to a relationship. I'm not looking anywhere else for love or affection, but I'm sure not in a relationship where we're giving that to one another, serving one another. We have settled. We've settled for a shallow relationship. And the Bible would call that sin. Some of you need to take a greater responsibility for the neglect that you're causing in your relationship. You need to show up as the man of God. You need to show up as the woman of God in your relationship and serve one another. Realize you're better together than you are apart. It's time to stop the excuses. It's time to get over our pride and our stubbornness. And it's time to serve each other. Galatians 5:13 says, serve one another in love. Ephesians 4:32 says, be kind and compassionate, forgiving one another. Ephesians 5:21 says, submit to one another. Submit to one another. And 1 Thessalonians 5:1 says, encourage one another and build each other up. This is how the Bible directs us in our relationships. We're to care for one another. We're to meet each other's needs. We're to serve one another's in loving ways. This is God's answer to loneliness. And some of us need to step this up. Because when you risk to rely, not only is it God's answer to loneliness, but it's God's answer to weariness. This is God's answer to weariness. That text we read earlier from Ecclesiastes 4:9 says, two are better than one. Why? Because they have a good return for their labor. That's why. It's like this week I was down at my in-laws' place doing some work. We were staining and painting and doing some work down there. And I was talking to my son, Nathan, my oldest son, and before I left, just to see if he could go with me. And so he was trying to check his work schedule and everything to find out if he could or not. And his first response to me was, I can go, but I'm going to have to come back several hours earlier than on Friday than you were when you came back. And I said, you know what? It's worth it to me. Several hours earlier with two of us working is going to be way better than if I just do the whole thing by myself. So I was up for that. Now, as it turned out, he wasn't able to go. But the reason I was up for that is because two are better than one. We even see that in maybe you've heard the illustration before. A draft horse can pull like 8,000 pounds. Hopefully this is accurate. Can pull like 8,000 pounds. But when teamed up with another draft horse, they can pull like 24,000 pounds. In other words, together they can pull way more than even the sum of each of them individually. The point being that we are better together. That doing life alone is weary. It's exhausting. That God created us so we could serve one another. He created us different so that we could actually be better than we are just alone. That's why even in the church, He's given us multiple gifts. And they're different gifts. Not because one is more important than the other, but because they're all valued in the church, because together we are better. This is what the Bible teaches. And what is a struggle sometimes in our relationships is those differences that have maybe attracted us together, maybe even the differences that at one time we celebrated. Over time, those differences can aggravate because they're different. But the Bible would reveal that when we celebrate the differences, when we acknowledge them, we draw closer together, we are stronger as a result. Maybe some of you have grown weary because of the differences. I know that even there's personality differences. I know Kim and I, we have differences. You know, I'm a destination person. I like to get from point A to point B. I like to do it quickly, which is why it stresses her out when she's riding with me in the car, because she wants to enjoy the journey. Those are two very different goals, to enjoy the journey and get there, you know, in an efficient manner. Those are very different goals. No doubt those different goals have aggravated us from time to time. She enjoys shopping, looking. Based on my knowledge, there are no formal plans for us to move or to relocate to another home somewhere in the area, but you wouldn't know it by how many listings my wife looks at online and then wants to fill me in all about it. If I have cash burning a hole in my pocket and this all makes sense, then I'm ready to go. Otherwise, you know, I have to work to listen and be excited about these things that she's very interested in. We're very different. But the old African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. If we want to go far, we got to go together. You know, for some of you, you've been sitting here patiently through the last several weeks. You've been listening to the RAM model as we especially talk about rely today, that we're going to rely on one another. You've heard us talk about all of this. And you're listening to this. And you're like, Wayne, we messed up day one. In fact, we're not in a really healthy relationship right now. It was messed up. You know those stories you just told about Luana and Tom? Yeah, that's us. And things aren't going well, and we're struggling. So what about us? Well, here's what I'd have to say to you. If you feel like I married the wrong person out of emotional unhealthiness, I would say this. Sometimes you make the right decision, and sometimes you make the decision right. Sometimes you make the right decision, and then sometimes you just make the decision right. It is amazing what God can do with two people who have started off so unhealthy, so messed up. They didn't make the right decisions, and yet God, who's a God of reconciliation and restoration and wholeness, can restore it. Sometimes you started an unhealthy relationship, but God's going to make it right. And you can get the help of a counselor. We got recommendations. We can help you with that. But it's time to make it right. Now, I know up to this point, we've been talking about healthy relationships with others in our lives, what that looks like when we begin to rely. Whether you are doing this at work and you have some people you need to begin to rely on that you trust, but you have not yet leaned into them because you're a control freak. And you know right now you need to start giving up some control so you can begin to have healthier work relationships. Or you're married or you're dating, either way. But here's a component I don't want us to fail to think about. Some of you are failing not only to rely on other people that you can trust, but some of you are failing to rely on God. What we know about God, some of you would even say, hey, I trust God. You know God. You would say you trust God. But are you relying on God with everything you are, with all of your life? Or are you having that attitude of self-reliance? I do it myself. Or maybe you've been hurt before and you just want to take it out at God. It's His fault and you're creating distance between you and God. I want to encourage you today to risk to rely on God for this reason. Because if you do, God's answer is complete fulfillment. If you take a risk to rely on God, you will find God's answer to complete fulfillment. He is everything you need. He's everything you desire. The only way you can even have really a healthy reliance on other people is if you have a complete reliance on God. People who are completely dependent on Him find healthy interactions in their relationships with others. This is how this works. As we grow closer to God, we grow closer to one another. 1 John chapter 4, verse 16 says, and so we know and we rely on the love God has for us. God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God and God in them. And so we know and we rely on the love that God has for us. How do you know that you can trust this? The reason you can trust it is because Jesus is saying, just look at my hands. Just look at my feet. Stop doubting and believe. Believe that I love you. Believe I paid a price for you. Believe I was raised from the dead for you. Believe that I am your hope. I am your salvation. I am everything you need in life. You rely on me. Do you want salvation? Rely on me. Do you want hope for eternity? Rely on me. Do you need hope to get through till tomorrow? You rely on me. He is everything you need. So I'm going to ask right now that you would just stand to your feet. And I'd like for our servers to be dismissed. And we're just going to sing and lift up our voices to God right now. We're going to behold this. We're going to behold a lamb with crowns of thorns on his head. We're going to behold a lamb that shows us the Father's heart for us. We're going to behold a lamb who was crucified on a cross, whose blood was poured out. He loves you. Just look at his hand.